This is a demonstration of exercise S85 applying the allowance method to account for uncollectibles. The accounts receivable balance and allowance for bad debts for Signature Lamp Company at December 31st, 2017 was $10,800 and $2,000 credit balance for the allowance account. During 2018, Signature Lamp completed the following transactions. In requirement 1, the problem states, journalize Signature Lamp Company's transactions for 2018, assuming Signature Lamp uses the allowance method. The first transaction states sales revenue on account $273,400 and ignore cost of goods sold. To record this transaction, we would debit accounts receivable for $273,400 and we would credit sales revenue for the same amount. Our next entry says that we collected on account $223,000, so we would have debited cash and we would credit accounts receivable for $223,000. C states that we wrote off uncollectibles of $5,900. So when we write off an uncollectible account, we would debit the allowance for bad debts for $5,900 and we would credit accounts receivable for that amount. The D part says bad debts expense of $5,200 was recorded, so we would debit bad debts expense and we would credit the allowance account for $5,200. The second part of the problem says to post the transactions to the accounts receivable, allowance for bad debts, and bad debts expense T accounts and determine the ending balance for each account. So we have accounts receivable, allowance for bad debts, and bad debts expense, and we have the beginning balances that the problem gave us already recorded. Our first debit to accounts receivable would be for the sales that we recorded. So that would be a debit of $273,400. Then we would have a credit to accounts receivable for the collections of $223,000. And then we would have had another credit to accounts receivable of $5,900 for the accounts we wrote off. And we would also have a debit to the allowance account for that. And then we have the recording of the bad debts expense. So we debited bad debts expense for $5,200 and we credited the allowance account for $5,200. So now we have our balances in these three accounts: $55,300 debit balance for accounts receivable, a $1,300 credit balance for the allowance, and a $5,200 debit balance for the bad debts expense. Part 3 of the problem says show how accounts receivable would be reported on the balance sheet at December 31st, 2018. Well, we would have our accounts receivable balance of $55,300 and then we would have our allowance account balance as a subtraction from that because it is a contra account to accounts receivable. So we would show the net amount, or have this amount shown as net, of $54,000 for accounts receivable as a current asset as of December 31st, 2018. And that is the conclusion of the demonstration for exercise S85.